Lovelies, welcome and or welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name's Maria. I'm still quite new here, so still working out my schedule, but I'll plan to be posting a video once a week. It'll be anything bookish, so it can be book hauls, book reviews, reading vlogs, things like that. I do have a Booktube newbie tag and a few other videos that I've already posted, so I'll link them down in the description box below if you want to check those out. But today's video is going to be my 10 top fantasy romance books of all time. That I've read at least. I'm kind of categorizing fantasy romance. It has to be a good fantasy element in there as well, so it'll be, you know, good world building, good plot, but that there is, you know, a heavily romantic influence in the story, and it's kind of a good balance between the two. So that's kind of how I'm categorizing the fantasy romance. Let's just get into the series that I think are the top 10 that I've read so far. Okay, so the first few series, I'm actually going to group them together. It's basically the SJM Universe. So the first series I read from Sarah J Maas is A Court of Thorns and Roses. Now, if you're part of the book community, part of, you know, bookstagram, booktube, booktalk or anything like that, you'd probably have to be living under a rock to not have heard about this series. But basically, ACOTAR follows our main protagonist, Feyre. She lives in the human lands in a kingdom where we also have fae. Now in the past, because of certain wars and things like that, the fae and the humans don't interact. She's the main kind of provider for her family. She's in the woods hunting one night and she kills a wolf, brings it home, sells its skin, things like that to make some money. Turns out that that wolf was actually a fae, or the lord of the spring court. Comes along and takes Feyre from her home. It kind of grows from there, so there's not too much I want to tell without, you know, giving spoilers, and to be honest, you'd probably be very lucky to have avoided spoilers for this one. But basically with SJM, the reason I'm kind of grouping it together is firstly because there's a lot of books within these series, so it would fill up my 10 spaces pretty quickly. But I would say that all of her series are actually quite different, even though, you know, they're kind of usually grouped together. So I would say that ACOTAR is probably highest on the fantasy romance spectrum. So yes, there is a lot of world building, yes there is a lot of, you know, politics and things like that, but some of the main story, you know, there's a good balance there with the romance between Feyre and the love interest, which again I can't really say too much without spoiling some of it, but a lot of it is to do with the romance as well. And even as the series goes on and you're looking at different characters, the romance is extremely prominent. So that's why I would say it's more of the fantasy romance genre. But if we move on to her next series, so Throne of Glass, this is her YA series, so probably targeted more at the 14 to 18 age range, whereas some of the later books might be more of the kind of the 16 and above. But to be fair, for the most part this is pretty much a YA series. But for this one I would definitely say that it follows more of the, there is romance in there, but it's definitely not integral to the story. You know, the story is more about the politics, the world and the narrative that's going on. So for this one we follow our main protagonist, Selena. So she has come from a slave encampment in Dover. Basically the king is looking for an assassin and he's holding trials to find the best assassin within the kingdom, and Selena is picked from Dover to go and participate in these by the prince. So he was given a task to find a participant and she will be going through these tasks to see if she can make it as the king's assassin. And again, we take it from there. With SJM, you'll find that the first book kind of gives us a very introductory, you know, setting, and usually by the end of the book you can't believe it's part of the same series because it's expanded so much. But yeah, I would say Throne of Glass is more on the YA side. There's minimal spice. The spice only kind of comes in the later books, which is why I would say, you know, maybe from book 5 onwards to maybe say that it's 16 and up. But for the earlier books this is definitely, you know, appropriate for 14 and above. Yeah, this one's, as I say, a bit more of that fantasy driven with a little bit of romance in there. And then her third series, which is Crescent City, and this is probably the one you've seen most recently because it is the most recently published one, and the third book in the series came out in January. This one, it's more of an urban fantasy. So, you know, it's all, you have all the mod cons in there. It's not what we would probably associate as a medieval setting. So yeah, slightly different from the two before. This one, we kind of also have a murder mystery aspect. So we start off with our main protagonist, Bryce Quinlan. She, at the start of the book, her best friend is murdered, and we kind of follow her journey and trying to figure out who done it. Again, with this one, don't think the romance is kind of the main plot driver. Again, it's a very good balance between that, you know, the plot could probably carry it without the romance, and in fact some people actually don't really like the romance in this one. If that's the type of thing you like, I would definitely suggest, you know, Sarah J Maas. If you're new to fantasy romance, this is definitely one of the good starting points. It's, you know, it's not incredibly dense or anything in terms of the world building, however there's enough to kind of keep your brain going, as well as just the romance. You know, it's not just a romance in a fantasy setting, in my opinion. But yeah, I would definitely recommend all three series. They're three of my favourite series, but I'm kind of grouping them into one because I'm cheating, basically. But yeah, all three of the SJM series I would definitely recommend. The next series I'm going to suggest is another popular one, and another one that you've probably seen on BookTok, Bookstagram and things like that, and that's From Blood and Ash by Jennifer L. Armentrout. Now this one has been blowing up recently and over the last couple of years. There's quite a lot of books in this series as well, but basically this one follows our main protagonist Poppy, who is the maiden within this kingdom, and basically her life is she's to be chaste, she's, you know, not to speak to anyone, no one's to touch her, she's to be kind of this enigma within the kingdom. Essentially the fate of the kingdom rests in her hands, and she's told she has this greater destiny that she will be following to save the kingdom. For most of her life she's kind of been resigned to that, she's been happy to, you know, fill that role. That is until a guard named Hawk comes into her employ and is set the task of protecting her as well. And a lot of what he says and a lot of what he does kind of makes her question what she's been brought up to know. The story kind of goes from there, and with this one I think there's a lot of, you know, found family elements, there's a lot of witty banter, a lot of sarcasm, which I usually tend to like in my fantasy romance as well. And yeah, it's just a really good series, a really fun series. It is quite a long series, so I think there's around 5 books out in the series so far, and there is actually a companion series which is almost like a prequel series to this one as well, and it starts with A Shadow in the Ember, and it kind of is a prequel, you know, hundreds of years before this one, and it kind of just gives some context to this as well. So I've read all of the series, I've read all of the prequel as well, really loved it. I will say that this one gets mixed reviews in terms of the writing quality, and yes, it's probably not the greatest in my opinion, but the story really carries it, and I think just the banter and the found family elements really kept me gripped. I will say the latest book I wasn't 100% kind of invested, but I'm really excited for the next installment, which I think is out in June. So yeah, this is another one that I would recommend. This next one is one that you may have seen, but for me it's pretty underrated, to be honest, in terms of the fame and kind of the attention that we get for SJM and JLA for the series that they wrote. I definitely think this one deserves just as much hype. I definitely think the writing in this is beautiful as well. So this is Guild, and it's by Raven Kennedy, and basically the premise of this, it's almost like a King Midas retelling. We follow our protagonist Orin, who is, they call it a saddle, it's basically like a concubine, or, you know, a mistress of the king. So King Midas is the male protagonist in this first installment. And yeah, it's kind of just following her life, and first book I would say, and kind of the advice I give a lot of people when they're jumping into this one is the first book sets a very different tone than the rest of the series. It is almost like a prequel to what's going to happen in the rest of the series. But I would definitely say if you can make it through this one, the rest of the series is 1,000,000% worth it. Honestly, I rated this one 2.5 when I first read it because of some of the themes and some of the things that came up. But as soon as I read book 2, I was absolutely invested, and I think it's book 3, which is Gleam, is when I was like, this is one of my top series ever, even though the first book I kind of rated it really low. As soon as I moved into that second book, the narrative develops and we hear a bit more of the story, a bit more of the background, you know, and we see kind of where the world building was coming from in this one. I would say it's 1,000,000% worth it. So yeah, I couldn't recommend this one any more highly. Okay, so the next two I'm actually going to group together as well. They are by the same author, but again, I would say they have very different vibes. In terms of the writing, it is quite similar, but in terms of the vibes of the story, they are very different. So the first one is The Serpent and the Wings of Night by Carissa Broadbent. Again, this was kind of hyped on TikTok, and it kind of had its day. I think for about a month, this is probably all you would have seen on Bookstagram or BookTok. Really, you know, a lot of people were reading it. I think it was because the sequel came out, so a lot of people were picking it up, so it was definitely getting all of the hype. But this one follows our main female protagonist, Aurea, who is a human who has been living with vampires for her whole life. So she's actually the adopted daughter of the vampire king. Essentially with this one, you have a goddess whose name is escaping me right now. Goddess of Death, it just says on here. But basically there is some trials which I believe are called the Kajari. If you win those, you will get a favour from the goddess of death. So it could be, you know, to have magical powers or anything like that. So Araya has a favour that she wants to ask for, so she does enter the Kajari, even though she will be, you know, going against vampires. She, you know, has been trained by the Vampire King himself, so she has confidence that she will win it and she will be able to get that favour. She does then get paired up with the main male protagonist, who is Rain. And again, in this one, there's a lot of angst. It's kind of an enemies to lovers story. So initially they do have, you know, a lot of animosity and angst, and they are actual, you know, enemies. In this one, I would say it is true to that enemies to lovers description. As I say, it just kind of goes through the trials. They kind of half team up as they go along. There's a lot of angst, and then there's a great twist at the end. And then there is a second book out which kind of, you know, unfolds straight from the action as well. And there is actually a novella in between this one and the second book, The Aishas and the Star-Cursed King, called Six Scorched Roses, which again just follows two characters who come into the second book. But again, it's around 100 or so pages, but it's a romance novella, and how she manages to make us connect with characters within that amount of pages is crazy to me. But yeah, it's really good as well. But this one I would recommend if you're more interested in the romance side of things, because this one is that better balance, and I would say it's probably tipped more on the side of the romance. There is still really good world building, there's still a really good plot, but the romance is more heavily focused on this one. So if you're more of a romance fantasy reader, if that makes sense, this would be the one I would probably pick up from Carissa Broadbent first. And the next one is Daughter of No Worlds. So this one follows our main protagonist, Tisana, and she has been living a life of slavery for as long as she can remember. And we kind of start off learning of her, you know, surroundings, where she is, who she's a slave to. And there's a few things that happen, and essentially she ends up murdering the most powerful person in Thrall, I believe it is. Yes, in Thrall, who was her master. Because of that, she ends up having to flee, and it brings her to what is known as the Orders, who are kind of the entity who manage magic within the kingdom, and they task her to get some training with Maxentarius Farleone, who I just have to say is one of the best book boyfriends there is out there. So Maxentarius is the kind of epitome of a grumpy, angsty, reluctant trainer. They start doing their training and they start getting a little bit closer. Obviously feelings start to develop, and there's a lot of a political undertone in this one, in terms of, you know, different kingdoms who are maybe fighting for freedom, you know, the Orders having so much power, and maybe some of the, you know, slaves trying to pull some of that back. And again, this first book really just dips its toes into that, because when you move on to the second and the third book, you know, the world just expands massively. I will say that this one will break your heart, but you'll enjoy it. You know, it's one of those ones that you'll be reading it just going, surely nothing else can go wrong for this team, but it does. So yeah, definitely read this one if you prefer, maybe if you're more into high fantasy but you want to dip into that romantasy stream. This one is definitely still kind of reminiscent of some of the more high fantasy that I've read, because it does have a lot of political intrigue, it does have a lot of kind of converging plot points that come together at one point. But there's enough romance in there to kind of keep you interested and invested in the characters as well. So yeah, but definitely recommend this one. So on the topic of books that will break your heart, the next one again is one that I would say is severely underrated. I hardly ever hear anybody talking about this, and I don't know if it's just because it's an older series or if it's because it's in the YA section. But yeah, An Ember in the Aishas by Saba Tahir is definitely up there with some of the best books I've read, not even just in, you know, fantasy romance, but in general. You know, in terms of the writing, the world building, the plot, everything is just impeccable. So this one follows, our main female protagonist is in a lower class. So we have an empire which is built up by the Martial Empire, which is kind of like a military academy, and then the scholars, who are kind of the more lowly people, the people who are kind of looked down upon, almost slaves. You know, a lot of time they'll have to do free labor and things like that. So basically, Leah's brother ends up getting arrested by the martial soldiers, and she goes on a quest to try and get him from the Martial Academy where he's being held captive. Now there we have our male protagonist, who is Elias, and he has grown up as a martial soldier his whole life. It's kind of been, his life has been training to become a martial soldier. His mother is the, what is called the commandant in the Martial Academy, so kind of the highest ranking leader within that, and I think his grandfather was the previous one before. So, you know, he comes from a family of martial soldiers, and basically In order to get into the military, you need to complete a certain amount of tasks. So the soldiers who are in the academy will go through a certain amount of trials to see who comes out at the end victorious, and then they will be part of the martial army as well and will be given roles within that. So obviously, as Leia tries to infiltrate the martial academy, Elias and her paths cross, and it's kind of again, enemies to lovers is definitely prevalent in this, and it is proper enemies to lovers. You know, there's definitely hatred there. It's not just we had an argument once and now we're enemies. Obviously their paths cross and they kind of end up teaming up because they have some shared values, and again the story just kind of takes off from there. But with this one, I would say that there's definitely elements of found family. There's a lot of heartbreak in this, and it's actually quite dark considering it's a YA novel. I would say there's a lot of dark themes explored within it. So yes, while it's YA, because there's no spice really in it, there is a lot of tenderness, and the romance that you get within it is so satisfying that if you're like me, the spice is kind of, if it's there, great. If not, I'm not really that fussed. But with this one, the love story is just so beautiful as well. But yeah, I would say even though it's YA, definitely covers some really dark themes, and just be prepared to get your heart broken. Don't get too close to any of the characters because who knows if they're going to make it. But yeah, I would definitely recommend this one if you like ones that are maybe set in a bit of a different setting. A lot of the time we're reading stories about fae and things like that. This one doesn't cover that. It is something different that we maybe haven't seen, you maybe don't see as often. So yeah, I think just if you haven't read this one, as I say, it's one of the best series I've read ever, regardless of it being in the fantasy romance genre. It's one that always sticks in my mind. If people are asking me when it comes to fantasy romance, what book would I recommend? It's usually this one, or another one that I will be mentioning is top of my list. So yeah, if you're going to pick one from this list, I know that most people have probably read SJM and things like that, but if there's one that you're going to pick out of the ones that maybe you're not as familiar with, definitely this one, or the next one I'm going to mention. So again, talking about books that I think are severely underrated. If you've maybe watched my wrap up, I think I mentioned it maybe 4 times, even though I didn't read it that month. But yeah, this one is Strange the Dreamer by Lenny Taylor. Firstly, Lenny Taylor's writing is beyond, it's so beautiful. It's purple prose, it's quite lyrical, but it's not so lyrical that kind of the plot or the narrative is lost within there. She just has this way with words that, I don't know, for me, it just really sticks with me. It's stuck in my heart. And this is the first book that I read from Lenny last year as a buddy read with a girl that I know from Bookstagram. This one, so it follows our main male protagonist is Laszlo Strange, and he is an orphan and he's kind of working with the scholars. Essentially what he's always been obsessed with is this lost city of Weep. And as part of his role within the scholars, he always tries to, find any tidbits of information that he can get about it. He's wondering, where did this city disappear to? What are the mysteries surrounding it? Essentially, he ends up getting an opportunity to travel to Weep and to hopefully, get some of the answers that he has been looking for. He goes to meet a man who was called the Godslayer, as about 100 years ago there was a war, and essentially since then the mystery of Weep and the lost city, no one's been able to find it, no one's been able to go there. But Laszlo gets the opportunity to go there, and he ends up meeting a blue-skinned goddess who appears to him in a dream, and then he meets her in real life, and the story kind of unfolds from there. And it's one of those ones where it's not afraid to break your heart. At the same time, there's a lot of kind of lightness and jovial narrative in there as well. So it's not kind of it's not a really dreary series at all. The main male character is definitely one of those, what you would call a cinnamon roll book boyfriend, essentially. So he's just the sweetest, kindest person, and thoughtful in terms of when he ends up with the female protagonist. And yeah, I just think with this one, it's just one of those books that when you're reading it, you almost forget that you're reading. You're just so immersed in this world, you're so invested in the story. Lenny Taylor has an ability to get you attached to the characters really quickly, so within a few chapters you're already rooting for them. And yeah, this one is just one of those ones that I don't think I've read anything like this before, even with other people who I would say use purple prose or lyrical writing, like Stephanie Garber and things like that. It's just not, there's something about Lenny's writing that just really works for me. This one is severely underrated, so it's definitely one I would say to check out, but she does have another series which I believe you're supposed to read first, so let me just get that one. So her other series is Daughter of Smoke and Bone, and this actually came out before The Strange the Dreamer duology. And this one, if you watch my wrap up, you will have seen that I went through this one, so I won't go too deep into this one because I did give my thoughts on the series then. But essentially it follows Carew, who is an art student in Prague, and she essentially works for some monsters on errands and things like that. And then there's angels come to the city, been a war that's been going on, and it all kind of unfolds from there. But yeah, this one, apparently if you read this one first, when you read Strange the Dreamer, you will see some Easter eggs from both of the series. So yeah, I would definitely recommend maybe read this series first, so Daughter of Smoke and Bone, and then jump into Strange the Dreamer. But with both of them, I would say the writing in this one didn't start off as lyrical, but then as we got to the end, it definitely came to the writing that I was used to from Strange the Dreamer. But I'm really looking forward to rereading this one actually, so that I can see if I can figure out any of the plot points that are connecting with this one. So yeah, most of the recommendations that I will give you today will be ones that you've maybe heard before. It's likely you haven't heard of these, or you haven't looked up the synopsis or anything. I honestly couldn't recommend her enough. So yeah, definitely check these ones out. So the next series I'm going to talk about is by Cassandra Clare. And I mean, there's series within series in this one, but basically it's the Shadowhunter series, and it starts out with the Mortal Instruments, which I think there's 6 books in this series. But yeah, basically the first one starts out with Clary Frey, who believes she is human, and basically her and her friend Simon bump into what are, you know, essentially angels while they're out. And then, yeah, she kind of finds out that maybe what she thought she knew when she was growing up isn't quite true. You've probably heard of shadow hunters, you know, I think there's movies, TV shows and things like that, but basically shadow hunters are there to fight evil within the world. They're there to fight, you know, vampires, werewolves, things like that. With this one, it's a lot more YA, so from my memory, I don't think there's any spice really in here. There's like references to things and, you know, discussions about things, but it's not a spicy book at all, because in one I think the characters are around 16 in this, so it definitely feels YA. But what I will say is that the story is really good and it's really thought out and the plot's really good, so it's definitely one that even if you're not in that age range, I would definitely check this one out. So Mortal Instruments, I've read the first 6 books. There's also a series or a trilogy that you're supposed to read kind of in between the first 3 and the second 3, which is the Infernal Devices. So it starts off with Clockwork Angel, and what I will say is I've really enjoyed the Mortal Instruments series, but the Infernal Devices series, starting off with Clockwork Angel, was absolutely amazing. And it was one that really, at the end of it, you will cry. If you don't cry, I mean, I'm not really a crier at books, but that one, it definitely brought a few tears to my eyes, so definitely recommend them all. I still want to continue with the series, so I can only really judge this one on the first 9 books that I've read in the series, and I think in total there's around 18 at this point. I would say out of what I've read so far, the Infernal Devices were definitely my favourite, but I still couldn't recommend the rest of the series anymore. So the next series I'm going to talk about, again, it's probably one that you've heard before. It's Caraval by Stephanie Garber, and I am going to be linking in the other kind of companion series, but we'll start off with Caraval. So Caraval centres around this carnival that kind of comes to a certain island once every however many years. And basically to go there you have to be invited. So Scarlett, who's the main protagonist in the first book, has been writing a letter to the guy who's the leader of Caraval to see if she can get an invitation for her and her sister. One year it turns out that he replies, so they go on a quest to find the carnival of Caraval, and then once they get there, Scarlett's sister Tella actually goes missing. So Scarlett has to then try and find her to save her, and along the way she will meet an MMC who will aid her in finding Tella along the way. So yeah, there's a bit of a love interest there. I think I was saying with Strange the Dreamer, this one has much more, maybe not kind of purple prose, but it's a lot more lyrical in that way in terms of the writing. So it definitely feels like a fairy tale when you're reading it. Again, I think this one is in the YA section, so limited space, but it does still really, you know, appease that appetite for romance. And again, there's a couple of twists and turns in there that keep you guessing. So the first book follows Scarlett and her quest to find Tella. The second book follows Tella. And in the third book, they kind of come together and you get a lot of answers to questions that were asked throughout the series. A lot of people say that you don't necessarily need to read this series to read the companion series. For me, I found that it was I mean, I didn't read this without reading it, so I can't really judge it, but I did find that it gave me a richer experience and a richer understanding of the world to read this one first. So from my personal recommendation, I would definitely say to read the trilogy first and then move into Once Upon a Broken Heart. So Once Upon a Broken Heart follows a character, Evangeline, who, again, she's very, very whimsical. She's very young, and almost at some points you do feel kind of frustrated at her naivete. You know, she is quite naive when it comes to trusting people and some of the actions that she does, but I think it's kind of part of her charm and part of her characterization, but you'll maybe see mixed reviews on that. But yeah, Once Upon a Broken Heart follows a character who we do meet within the Caraval trilogy, and again, I think that's kind of why, for me, I feel like it's definitely one that you should read after reading Caraval, because you get that kind of backstory and you have a bit more of an understanding on who the character is and where they've come from. This one kind of follows Evangeline. She's basically in love with this guy. She finds out that he is going to marry her sister. In order to try and stop that happening, she makes a deal with the Prince of Hearts, and the deal is that he will get 3 kisses for anyone that he chooses, whenever he chooses, for her to get the love of her life. So she makes the deal, and basically from there chaos ensues from start to finish, you know, and a lot of it you're kind of thinking, what is the plot? What is going on here? I would say for me the best book in the trilogy is probably Ballad of Never After, which is the second book. The third book, while it wasn't exactly what I was expecting, I still found it really good. I still really enjoyed the writing, and I still really enjoyed kind of the conclusion to the story. It just wasn't exactly what I was expecting. So I would say definitely the first book is great, the second book is the best. The third book, for me personally, wasn't the best conclusion, but I would still recommend the series wholeheartedly. So this next one's by an indie author, so it's by Pen Cole, and it's Spark of the Everflame. And if you did see my wrap up, you may have seen me talking about this one because I read it last month. But this one has restored my faith in current romantasy. So essentially I've been reading, you know, romantasy is probably one of my favourite genres. At the start of the year I just kept reading them and they just weren't hitting the way they normally would, you know. It just felt like every story was the same. It was almost as if, you know, the author was given tropes that they had to include, and they basically done that and not much else. I was getting a little bit downhearted thinking, oh, you know, maybe romantasy's not for me anymore, maybe I need to start looking at different genres. And then I read this one, and as I say, it restored my faith. So this one we follow DM, who is part of the human realm. So basically within this realm we have the descended, who are descended from gods. Basically they have powers, and I would say they were quite akin to the Fae. I'd say that's probably what they're most similar to. DM lives in the human world, and basically the humans are, you know, downtrodden, usually don't earn, you know, kind of living in slums and things like that. So at the start of the book, DM is working as a healer, and her mother is also a healer, but at the start of the book her mother goes missing, and she's been missing for around 6 months, and basically DM just wants to try and find her. Part of her healer role, she ends up becoming a healer for the descendant royals, because that's the job that her mother used to do. So she steps into her mother's role, and from there she meets Luther, who is the male protagonist in this. Now what I will say is this one is slow burn. It takes a long time for the romance to kick off, but it does have romance in there with the childhood sweetheart, so you do get that kind of romantic narrative in there, but it's slow. Let's just say within this one there's not a lot of romance of who you wanted to be with essentially. But yeah, this one is really good. So there's 3 books out currently. 4th book comes out in June, and the way that the 3rd book was left off, I cannot wait until June. I need to know what happens. But yeah, if you've been kind of feeling similar to me, where some of the more popular romantasies that have been out recently and some of the more recent releases haven't really been hitting the mark, definitely don't skip this one. It's not within that bucket for me. It's definitely worth your time, and yeah, would definitely recommend. So this last one I'm going to talk about is a little more on kind of the gothic, dark vibes. So it's probably, again, one that you may have heard of, but it's One Dark Window by Rachel Gillig. And this follows our main female protagonist, Elsbeth, who basically has a demon within her mind, who she calls the Nightmare. So she speaks with him and he kind of protects her and advises her. But basically they live in a land called Blunder, and there's mists are kind of shrouding the woods and shrouding the town. There's a dark magic that's kind of taking over. She bumps into a highwayman who is basically one of the king's soldiers called Raven, and together they kind of work to see if they can help fix the blight that's coming over Blunder. The magic system is really interesting. So basically it's all surrounded around what they call providence cards, and with each card has, you know, magic within it. So the person doesn't have the magic, but the holder of the card will be able to use the magic of the card that they have. So there's a few different things that they can do there, but essentially Raven and Elsbeth, if they have all of the providence cards, they believe they'll be able to fix the blight that's coming over Blunder and save the realm. But obviously within that there is maybe some tension, some angst, some romantic feelings, a few, you know, plot twists and things like that along the way. And then the second book, Two Twisted Crowns, it kind of moves on to another couple of people as well, so it does kind of stay fresh. But yeah, with this one I would say that it is written as adult, but I would say there's minimal spice in it, and to me it did read a little bit more of a YA, so do with that what you will. You know, if you're a YA reader, you will still enjoy this. I did see that a lot of people kind of felt that the plot didn't move fast enough for them, so I think this one is definitely a you're there for the vibes, not so much the plot, even though for me personally the plot was really good. But I do think with this one, if you're not kind of linking with the vibes, it may not hit the same way. So for me, I was definitely vibing with it, you know, the gothic kind of eerie atmosphere. But if you're not really into that, this one probably won't be for you. But for me, it was definitely up there with some of my favourites, so I would highly recommend. If you have any recommendations for fantasy romance series that you love that I haven't mentioned here, I would really love to know it. So put them down in the comments. I'm always looking for more recommendations, new authors, new series and things like that. So yeah, let me know your favourite fantasy romance in the comments below. But if you've made it this far and you did like this video, I would really appreciate it if you liked and if you subscribed. It really will help my channel to grow. As I say, I'm pretty new here. The hope is to post, you know, at least once a week. It'll be videos like this with some recommendations within like a genre, as well as just like reading vlogs, coming along with me while I'm book shopping, book hauls and things like that. So yeah, again, any ideas you have for videos that you'd like to see or any recommendations, just let me know in the comments below. But other than that, thanks for watching and I'll see you in my next one.